Thank you for joining, everyone, and welcome to Foresight's Intelligent Corporation Group. Gernot, I really can't tell you how long and how much this group has looked forward in welcoming you. Because whenever someone is asking me about concrete things that are implementable today that could build intelligent systems or voluntary cooperation, then which is something that this group is interested in, then something that comes to mind is SeL4. And in this group and in the accompanying book draft, we really go from the premise that any desirable future will really rely on computer security at every level, from hardware to operating system to software, all the way to the user interface. And, it's essential for a variety of things, including de-risking cooperation, but also preventing essential attacks from automated weaponizable technologies and so forth, things that we all discussed here in the past. So I think SeL4 is really like a key, if you wish, for making sure that all of these technologies go well. And so we're really, really excited to have you here today. Very, very excited also to talk about, perhaps if we have time, even how SeL4 withstood a red team attack with such a good rating that attackers couldn't even make progress on figuring out how to make progress on attacking SeL4. So thank you so much from everyone here for joining. We look very much forward to your presentation and to the discussion afterwards. So thanks.
All right. So the SeL4 microkernel is, it's really about mathematically proving properties of a real world software system, in particular security relevant ones. So what is SeL4? It's an open source, high assurance, high performance operating system microkernel. So kernel means it's the part of the software that runs in the most privileged mode of the hardware. And that implies if it gets compromised, then everything else is compromised, because the kernel, there's no protection against what the kernel does. Operating system microkernel, meaning it's the core of an operating system. So you build an operating system on top of this kernel. It's high performance. I claim it's the world's fastest microkernel. There's some partial evidence of that, not a complete proof. And it's high assurance, and this is really what is SeL4 is famous for, in that it's the operating system kernel with the most comprehensive mathematical assurance story. And the cool thing, of course, it's open source, so it's really available under GitHub, and that doesn't apply only to the kernel itself, to the code, but also to the proofs. Everything is open source. And as such, SeL4 is arguably the most trustworthy foundation for building safety or security critical systems. And this is happening increasingly. So people are deploying SeL4 already in deployment or working on products that are going to be deployed across a large range of domains, including automotive, which is presently apparently the hottest area, avionics, space, defense, of course, is where SeL4 was initially mostly deployed because they are the most security paranoid, IoT, industrial automation, everything. So it's really taking off. And as I said, particularly in the automotive sector, we have this SeL4 Foundation, which was created a year and a half ago, and it had a very strong influx of automotive companies this year. Generally, companies operating on autonomous driving cars. And it seems like that's going to be the next big thing. In terms of performance, I said there's a partial proof in the sense that there's some independent comparisons of performance only against open source systems. These are latency numbers, so small is good, and done by researchers in China who we had nothing to do with. They wrote several papers on using extra hardware support for improving microkernel performance. And they, in the course of that, did comparison of SeL4 performance against two other microkernels, Fiasco and Google Zircon. And you can see from these tables, we're between a factor of 2 and 10 faster. And I know that the non-open source, or many of the non-open source systems, their performance is closer to that of Zircon than that of SeL4. So I'm unashamedly make this claim. It's the world's fastest microkernel. You can find the sources there. What's important to understand is a microkernel is not an operating system. It's the core of an operating system. So in a microkernel-based system, you have the typical operating system services, which includes storage systems, subsystems, networking, etc., general resource management. This is all contained in user-level processes that are running side by side with the native applications. So from the kernel's point of view, there's no principal difference between an application running on the system and an operating system service. They're all running at user mode, unprotected, but isolated by the kernel enforced protection boundaries. And the kernel's main job is really to switch between those domains, but also enable communication between them. And you can have virtual machines running legacy stacks. In most deployments of SeL4, we see that there's at least one virtual machine running a Linux guest operating system to support a legacy stack and the critical bits running native on SeL4. One of the by far not unique characteristics, but the critical characteristic of SeL4 is that it has a capability-based access control. So capabilities are the abstraction for the managing access rights to objects. You can think of a capability like a key that unlocks a particular object. And security-oriented operating system designs generally use capabilities. And of course, Mark Miller is part of your team, and he is one of the people who've been working in capability-based systems for a very long time. So I assume the idea is familiar. And so what that means in SeL4 in particular is that any components that run on top of the SeL4 microkernel can only communicate in any way if there's an explicit channel provided by that is accessed by a capability. So if you have the capability to such a channel, then you can communicate, and otherwise you cannot. So two components that do not have such a capability authorized channel are incapable of communicating. And this is part of key to the really strong not only isolation, but also the ability to enforce system-wide security policies in SeL4 in a way that's not possible in a system like Linux, for example, even if the Linux was corrected, bug-free, etc., which of course it is not. So no communication unless explicitly authorized. That's a classical property of capability systems. But in SeL4's case, it comes with the additional strengths that we know that the kernel, by mathematical proof, we know that the kernel will prevent communication if it's not explicitly authorized. And that gets me to what really defines SeL4, its mathematical proof story. So SeL4 is implemented in the C language. It's about 10,000 lines of code. And besides the C implementation, there's an abstract model. So that is a description of the functionality of the kernel in a mathematical logic. And what we now have is this proof of functional correctness, which means that the C implementation is a correct implementation of this abstract model. So in that very strict sense, the implementation of the kernel is bug-free with respect to this mathematical model of its functionality. And that's the thing that really made SeL4 famous. It was the first time this was done for any operating system with this complete functional correctness proof from a mathematical model to the C implementation. That itself is a very powerful property because you know that, yes, your implementation is correct against the model. It still leaves you at the mercy of the compiler, and compilers themselves are complex beasts that are full of bugs. GCC, for example, which we routinely use, is probably 1 million lines of code all up, etc. So there's plenty of bugs in there. And there's a risk the compiler will introduce bugs in the compiled binary. So we have a further proof that the C is correctly translated into the binary. And by transitivity, we now know that the binary code, which is the thing that actually executes on the silicon, is this correct translation of the abstract or correct implementation of the abstract model. And I got my thinking out of order. So that this comment that by now, the original functional correctness proof was done 12 years ago. By now, there's a few other operating system kernels with functional correctness proofs. They're generally in the toy category. There's only one I'm aware of that's sort of real world capable. The others are academic toys, but funnily, or to me, surprisingly, none of these are capability based. So SeL4 is still the only verified operating system kernel with capability based access control, and therefore this ability to reason about security enforcement in terms of security policies, etc. And in particular, the least privilege property, so that every component only is given the access rights it really needs to know more. Okay, so we have this proof chain from the abstract model down to the binary. That is extremely powerful because it means you can do all further reasoning at the level of the abstract model, which is much easier to reason about than a C implementation. But it by itself, it doesn't guarantee that the abstract model has the right properties. And for that, we have a further proof chain or set of proofs from the high-level security properties of confidentiality, integrity, availabilities. So we have proofs that the kernel, as represented by the abstract model, is able to enforce these security properties. And again, this is before transitivity, we know that this property holds for the actual binary that executes on the silicon. Now, all these proofs are machine checked, generally using interactive theorem proving, except the binary correctness proof is a tool chain, automated. And that's really important because as I said earlier, the C implementation is about 10,000 lines of code. The original functional correctness proof done on ARM v6 processors was about 180,000 lines of proof script. And that just shows you that if those were pen and paper proofs, they would be completely worthless because there would be more bugs in the proofs than in the code itself. Only by having these proofs machine checked, done in this interactive theorem proving framework, which does not allow you to make incorrect proofs, does this all make sense? And by now, this proof, the complete proof base we have for SeL4 is well above 1 million lines of proof script. When we originally did the functional correctness proofs, it was considered the second largest proof ever done. It might be the largest by now, but it's certainly by far the largest maintained proof base over an evolving system. SeL4 has changed a lot in 12 years since we did the original verification. We keep evolving the kernel because there's ongoing research to improve it, to broaden its applicability. And while we're doing this, we keep following with the verification. Things are not allowed to be committed against into mainline if they break the proofs. So the proofs are being kept updated. And there's no other system of similar complexity in terms of proofs that has been evolving in such a fashion. There's a number of limitations still there, even after 12 years. We haven't verified the boot code of the kernel. This is partially because it's boring as batshit, as they say in Australia. There's nothing interesting. It's just mind-boggling engineering work. We've kept sort of students / team members working on it in the background, but it's not complete. So someone would have to actually put money on the table to really complete that. It's not a big deal to do. It's just, we need it funded. And there's a few details that are not modeled to the same degree of faithfulness. So there's some rather abstract models about the memory management unit and the caches in the system that don't tie down to the instructor set architecture yet. Some of that has been, is in principle fixed, but not in practice. There was a PhD thesis recently that explained how to do the formalization of the translation lookup side buffer, so the MMU. So that could be integrated, but this is work that at the moment we don't have funding or time for. And we have the complete story for 32-bit ARM processors for RISC-V. We are close to having the complete proof story. This is likely to happen later this year. And x86, we just have the functional correctness proof. And I forgot to put on this list multi-core. We have a high-performance multi-core implementation, but no verification of it. So there's still work to be done. But the question is, so what does this really mean? So one is that, okay, we prove this functional correctness, that the kernel behavior is fully captured by the abstract model. And that means any further properties can be proved at the level of the abstract model. And that's a huge improvement, because this is in the right mathematical logic, where it's much easier to work with. And in particular, explicitly or implicitly, pretty much all the general attacks on operating systems are provably impossible in SeL4. So there's never going to be an assertion failure in a verified kernel. The kernel provably doesn't dereference null pointers or uninitialized variables, no out-of-bound access, so you can't run any stack smashing attacks on SeL4, etc. It will never run out of resources because it's got a verified resource management model. You can't fool it into doing stupid things by giving it misformed inputs, etc. So basically the whole range of the typical attack vectors against operating systems are categorically impossible in SeL4. So that's nice. And it's really important for us at the beginning when we started this project, we did not want to produce an academic toys. People have been misleading in a way the world by doing verification on academic toy examples and then pretending this scales, and it didn't in the end. We wanted to build and verify a system that was capable for real-world deployment right from the beginning. That was my target. What we learned from the DARPA Hackams program, where we worked with project partners in the US on securing real-world systems. And the important thing, they're existing real-world systems. So this is basically proving incorrect the long-held belief that a system has to be designed for security from the start, and it's impossible to retrofit security into it. We disproved that in the Hackams program. So what we did there, and as I said, most of the work was done by our collaboration partners. We worked with autonomous system, both aircraft as well as ground vehicles. And for each, we had a research vehicle and a military vehicle. So the research vehicle for the autonomous aircraft was this off-the-shelf drone, which basically we kept the airframe and replaced everything else. So this was a true green field design. And the land vehicle was this GVR bot, which is a US Army robotics reference platform. And there we could basically play with completely, replace everything we wanted and write a lot of new code. So this was for developing the technology. And then there were the military vehicles, and these were vehicles that already existed. So the aerial one is this unmanned little bird, which is a standard helicopter airframe, which Boeing converted for autonomous flight. That was already flying autonomously. And on the right, you have these US Army trucks. They are running around Detroit driverless. They're also existing system, and we retrofitted them for security. And the scary thing, even though these are military vehicles, the red team DARPA hired as part of the project took about 2 weeks to completely compromise this military helicopter. And working with our partners, and as I said, the work was mostly done by our partners because these systems are export controlled. We weren't even allowed to look at the code, so we could only instruct them what to do. They retrofitted these systems to put them onto SeL4, extract the critical components into protected sandboxes on SeL4, leaving a lot of the legacy code in Linux virtual machines. And in the end, the hackers couldn't compromise the systems anymore. The red team was incapable to break the UOB. We even gave them root access on one of the Linux virtual machines on the system. So they were on the platform, had complete control over this Linux system, could plant fork bombs, whatever they wanted. They could not affect the operation of the rest of the system. So that was a incredible success story that went way better than we had expected initially. So we kept the hackers out. SeL4 is not yet done. I indicated some of the holes that we still have in the assurance story, but there's still a lot of ongoing research, and I'm only highlighting a little bit of that. One is that this is a successor DARPA program where SeL4 in the whole formal methods framework is being integrated in a repeatable system engineering process. So these are avionics systems builders that they have their established processes and tool chains, etc. And the project partners in the DARPA CASE program are integrating SeL4 and other formal methods into this standard engineering tool chains with the idea of scaling it to really develop large-scale real-world systems. So this is a very applied research, I would say. And then there is time protection, which is a principled approach for preventing timing channels. So timing channels have been are now pretty much mainstream, started by the Spectre attacks, where they can compromise security in systems, leading to loss of disclosure of encryption keys, etc. With time protection, we are building abstractions, operating system abstractions, and tying them to hardware improvements that will allow to provably make timing channels impossible. And we already have working prototypes on that. We have hardware improvements that show that the necessary changes to the hardware are minimal and low overhead, both in terms of chip space as well as performance at runtime, that allows us to actually do that. And we're working on a formal proof that on a conforming system, we can eliminate these timing channels completely. We're also working on making the verification scale. At the moment, this is still a fairly expensive engineering process. Our estimates show that verification of a system like SeL4 is about a factor of 2 to 3 more expensive than sort of classical industrial standard quality assurance. We want to reduce that cost to par, in which case, of course, it makes no sense to use unverified software. And the key there is to have the right high-level languages that are suitable for implementing low-level code, but automate a lot of the assurance. And the newest project we're working on is what we call it Back to the Future. In the 80s, people have really tried to build complete operating systems with a high assurance of ideally proof that they enforce a security policy, and all these projects have failed to various degree. We believe it's time to restart that based on SeL4 and build the prototype of a really general purpose operating system where we can prove that it enforces the system-wide security policy. So in summary, with SeL4, we have shown that mathematical proof techniques really scale to real-world software. And that's, to me, the most amazing outcome of the whole SeL4 project. We have shown that provable security for a well-designed system is actually feasible, and that SeL4 is clearly a good basis for building these kind of systems. And we believe SeL4 is definitely defining the state of the art and has so for the past 12 years, and we're working on keeping it that way. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Wow, fantastic. I'm so happy you also tackled the DARPA challenge. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing your screen for just a moment. I will give first dibs in terms of questions to our participants, and then I'll have a few more from my end, but this was really fantastic. Thanks a lot. It was a really comprehensive overview, easy to understand, and and pretty inspiring in terms of the results. Richard, maybe you want to go first, and perhaps you want to say a few words about your background if you care, so Gernot has some context on it.
Sure. So I mainly come from artificial intelligence, a little bit to do with security for AI or AI security. So not so much at the OS level so much, but I am curious, can you describe how SeL4 would succumb or not to something like a Rowhammer attack, which would have behavior outside of that abstract model that you have?
So that's a good question. Oops, I'm sorry. Hold. Apologies, I got just interrupted. Not sure whether you heard that. So, yes, I didn't list the assumptions we have for these proofs. So basically, the core assumptions, which of course are not different for unverified software, you have to make the same assumptions plus more. But we have to make the assumption that the hardware operates as specified. And Rowhammer is actually a hardware bug. The hardware violates its contract. The contract for memory is that if you write something to memory and you read again, you read the same thing back, and Rowhammer violates that. So there is no general way of preventing these things. If the hardware is buggy, then it's buggy. Once you know about Rowhammer, then you can have specific defenses against these by ensuring your memory, the kernel is in control of physical memory allocation, and you can allocate memory so Rowhammer attacks will not hit anything sensitive. But that requires a model of the bug, basically. Short of that, the only real defense against those things is you need to drive verification down into the hardware to ensure that the hardware actually behaves according to specification. There's no other way around these kind of things.
And have you collaborated with anybody on trying to start to do that kind of thing?
So one of the nice things is that the ISA as the hardware software contract gives us a very well-defined interfaces and to compose that problem, right? So hardware people can work on their bits, we work on what we understand, which is the software. So I'm taking the easy way out and saying it's someone else's problem, but it basically comes down, yes, we agreed on the ISA as contract, and both sides need to ensure that this contract is honored. And we're obviously happy to collaborate with hardware verification people, but it's not our space. What we have done in the more specifically in the time protection context, where we found that, well, actually all present hardware is broken in the sense that it doesn't give you the right model to the right mechanisms for enforcing security protection against timing channels. There, of course, the conclusion is, well, and that's the case even if the hardware is correctly implemented. And so the conclusion is, well, obviously our hardware software contract is insufficient. It doesn't allow us to really provide security from timing channels. And that means it needs to be fixed. And we have a proposal published on how to fix the hardware software contract. It's a very modest big improvement. You just need to agree to some additional conditions that do not prevent any innovation on the hardware level. I don't think that trying to prevent people from doing speculative execution is reasonable, because that will never be accepted, because you throw away so much performance. So you need to have a much more, let's say, targeted. You need some restrictions, right? You need to agree on additional conditions, but they need to be really, at least as little onerous as possible and really targeted towards the minimum requirement. We try to do that, and we work with people at ETH Zurich, the people who did the Ariane open source implementation of a RISC-V processor. And so the group led by Luca Benini. And we could show that with some really very minor changes to the hardware, we create the right conditions that create a process that adheres to this modified contract that allows us to really eliminate timing channels.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. David, your question is next.
Yeah, just following along those same lines, just understanding more about what sort of hardware this is applicable to, and is it at all possible to apply this technology to defend against adversarial attacks in the hardware supply chain itself?
Okay, so in terms of hardware requirements, the requirements of SeL4 on the hardware is that you have protected mode, basically. So multi-mode execution and virtual memory. And beyond that, correct implementation. So adherence to the hardware software contract. Sorry, what was the second part of your question?
About adversarial attacks on the hardware supply chain?
Oh, yes. Yeah, that comes down to we have to trust that the hardware is implemented correctly. If someone builds a Trojan into the hardware, then all bets are off as far as we're concerned. I happen to be involved with a company in Munich, which called HENSOLDT Cyber. They have produced a RISC-V implementation that has a pretty strong supply chain attack protection by using circuit encryption or obfuscation, if you like. So the idea is that the gates on the circuit gate have extra inputs, and they only behave correctly if the right set of inputs, basically an encryption key, are supplied. And by that, it's infeasible to insert a Trojan, because in order to insert a Trojan into the hardware in the production process, you need to understand how the circuit is operating. So you can, the whole point of a Trojan is you need to be able to trigger it somehow. And so there needs to be a way to supply an external input that causes the hardware to change its operation in order to enable this Trojan. And in order to do that, you need to have a reasonable understanding of how the circuit operates. And by having this encrypted implementation of the circuit, that's infeasible. So that the idea is the key actually doesn't need to be extremely strong. You just have to be able to not break it in a time frame that's enough to understand the circuit, re-engineer it, put the Trojan in, build the netlist again, send it to production, and get it back quickly enough. So basically, we're talking about, say, a month or two is all this. This key needs to be secure for once the chip is produced, then you can publish the key. There's no problem with that anymore. So that's an interesting approach. I'm not a hardware expert. I cannot guarantee that this is really sufficient under all circumstances, but it's certainly much stronger than you get from anything else I've seen.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Next one up, we have Alan. And Alan, if you want to say a word also about you, just that for some context.
I'm Alan Karp. I have a PhD in astronomy and did ETH high performance computing for a long time. But when I first got into security, designing a big distributed system for sharing, I'd never heard of capabilities, and I ended up reinventing. And just by chance today, I'm wearing my Granovetter diagram shirt. So, just it was on top of the pot. I'm wondering how the work you're doing relates to what's being done on top of the Cherry hardware.
Yeah, so Cherry is, of course, a hardware level implementation of capabilities in the same sense as earlier capability hardware had it, like going back to the old Boros machine and the old 432, etc. So what Cherry capabilities, at least the last I've seen, I don't know whether there was any recent progress or extension of the model. What Cherry capabilities give you is basically a hardware enforced pointer safety. So you can't have stray pointers and compromise your system control flow integrity by basically forcing out of bound accesses of arrays or stacks, etc. So that's very powerful in the sense it really helps to protect untrustworthy software. So library code that is not verified and may have these kind of control flow integrity bugs. For SeL4, Cherry doesn't really buy you much because we sort of eliminate a lot of these attacks by construction, and the rest we just proved on the side without a lot of effort. It could possibly have saved us a little bit of work if we had Cherry enabled hardware underneath SeL4. So I see Cherry as sort of complementary in the sense that SeL4 gives you guaranteed protection between process or process isolation, whereas Cherry gives you process internal safety increases by ensuring that code that isn't verified can at least not produce attack vectors by out-of-bound accesses.
My understanding is that they're building a software stack on top of that. And I just wondered how that stack compared to the stack you've been talking about.
Well, so yes, I that's my understanding as well. And so basically, if you build software, application software on top of something like Cherry, then you get a lot of guarantees for free. So you don't have to prove pointer safety because the hardware ensures that. And so in terms of SeL4, as I said, the Cherry model basically gives you inter-process protection, whereas SeL4 gives you protection between processes. Now, in theory, you could say, okay, we don't need processes anymore. We run everything in a single address space. In my past life, we've been building a single address space operating system. We would have loved to have Cherry hardware at that time. There's advantages and disadvantages of the single address space model. Maybe with capability and hardware coming back, there is a revival of that idea. But beyond that, I see this as really complementary. It helps you giving assurance about your complex application level software, where you can avoid some verification tasks because you get properties for free. There's other ways you can achieve similar things. People have been pretty successful in applying model checking on a large scale for things like pointer safety, etc. I guess everything helps. So I don't see it the Cherry model to being a replacement for SeL4 or negating the need for SeL4. I think you definitely need the strong inter-process isolation unless you really go back to the single address space idea.
Thank you. Okay, we have one more from Chris Goddard, and then I have a few more, I guess, theoretical questions.
Hi, Gernot. I'm Chris. I hold a doctorate in mathematics. I've been working in software for a few years. So my question is more of a fairly general and open-ended one. I'm just interested in the proof languages that you use to construct your proofs. So I had a quick squiz at, I think, the repo that you use to contain all the implementations of your proofs for SeL4. And I saw mention of something called the iSpark proof method language. I was wondering if you might be able to speak to that or things around it.
So I'm the operating system guy. I'm not the formal verification guy. All I know is that we do almost all our verification work in Isabelle Hall. So that's a interactive theorem prover that originally came out of Cambridge, is now maintained and developed by the Isabelle group at TU Munich. It has a number of automation modules in there that tie to SMT solvers, etc. I'm pretty vague on that. It's just not my domain.
Okay, thanks. No, that's interesting. Gives me a couple of things to look up.
All right. I have a few more questions that are, I guess, more related to the theoretical aspects of, why would a layperson care about this? And, in the book, we basically make, the case that the insecurability of our software stack, and not just the insecurity, but really insecurability almost at this point, is a substantial risk that will only increase. And a few people, even here in this group, have written quite eloquently about this. Like David Mannheim wrote the Fragile World Hypothesis, in which he just talks about the risk of just if computer security continued, and the kind of withering away of our computer security infrastructure. So maybe you could kind of onboard us a little bit of like, what are the risks if we don't get around to securing more of our computer infrastructure, and could SeL4 at one point be scalable to actually do that entire stack, or what are the risks if we don't get around to solve this problem, and how can SeL4 help really on a like global economic, maybe even civilizational level?
Right. So I guess I'm preaching to the choir here in that, yes, software vulnerability is extremely scary, even in areas where people are not so aware of the problem, right? I live in Sydney, and one of my catch cries is there's no safety without security. And this is, for example, in the automotive sector, where people are only starting to really come around to the fact that you worry about safety all the time. You ignore security. Your system is not safe if it can be attacked by cyber attackers. And it requires a completely different kind of thinking, whereas the classical safety thinking is based on stochastic faults, where multiple faults are independent of each other, etc., none of which applies to software. And yeah, my standard example is I live in Sydney. When there's an accident on the harbour bridge and one lane is down, you feel it through the most of the city. The traffic is massively affected. And my estimate is by placing 10 accidents around the place, you basically shut the city down for a day. And without killing anyone, right? Just the economic damage alone is massive. Similar for other kinds of critical infrastructure. We know that power state generators, particularly remote managed ones, which is almost all these days, are not particularly hard to attack. So this is something we're working on. And so there's a true threat to society in terms of, in case of political tensions, you can really cripple an economy by using these cyber attacks, very targeted, or cyber criminals, organized crime can use it to extract huge amounts of money, as we've seen, for example, at the UK health system, where they use ransomware attacks on medical systems that are just not particularly protected from such attacks. So there clearly is a huge problem. And in terms of SeL4, well, we're sort of at the beginning, right? We managed to get some really strong security for 10,000 lines of code. So how does that scale to systems that are millions and tens of millions of lines of code? Well, fortunately, it's not quite as bad as it sounds. We don't have to scale verification up by 4 orders of magnitude to make some real world progress, which is good. A lot of comes down to actually architecting the systems correctly. And as we've shown in the DARPA Hackams program, this can even be done retroactively if you really put your mind to it. It's still an expensive process. You have to understand the system to re-engineer it, etc. And it still needs a lot of more support in terms of tooling, really trustworthy components on top, etc. But it's not a 4 orders of magnitude problem. It's maybe a 1 order of magnitude problem. And we've seen with COVID how research can be enormously accelerated by just putting money behind it. To me, the really positive takeaway of the COVID pandemic was that when the pandemic started, there has never been a vaccine against the coronavirus. And then the world decided there was a urgent need to solve this problem, and it took 9 months, and we had how many? Half a dozen of vaccines out there, and there's a dozen by now. So things can be accelerated a lot if there is the political will to put money behind it, and the international cooperation, I guess, is really key. So
yeah, I guess also what you had in COVID, you saw that how quickly scientists could develop a vaccine, and then,
yeah,
I guess, incentive schemes that then prevented vaccines from actually being distributed and getting to the right places. And I think with computer security, it's, I guess, similarly so that, we have an entire stack of an economy built up on insecure foundations. And, it's hard, I think, unless they really get a wake up call, and that wake up call may be too loud or too expensive, really, for much to be left to be rebuilt. I have you must really know this. Like, I guess I think the moment that you start thinking about it, you don't really know what to worry about first. A few things that one could worry about are like weaponizable technologies. You mentioned autonomous weapons, but of course that also holds for self-driving cars. Ultimately it's not just about the robots that are made out to kill, which are something that is people are extremely worried about. And FLI did a really fantastic video on the slaughter bots, and that is kind of terrifying and is driving the point home about how dangerous they may be, but also holds maybe for just weaponizable technology like autonomous cars. But then we're also worried about, for example, the electric grid potentially going out via power via a computer security attack. And then something that this group also is really interested in is how do those systems hold up as we kind of build more increasingly intelligent agents that we cooperate with. And so I was wondering whether, like those three threats in particular about autonomous weapons or about weaponizable technology, maybe about computer security attacks, and then also kind of like the how well does SeL4 actually hold up as we build increasingly intelligent systems? Do you have any ideas on this? Because those are things that are quite, I guess, relevant for interest in the group.
yeah. So trying to remember all the three, but in terms of autonomous systems, these are only accelerating a problem that already exists. If someone I don't actually own a car, but I drive one occasionally. If you drive a halfway recent car, then you being in control is an illusion, of course, because you're not in the control. There's already a computer in control of the car. But anything you do is just giving input signals to the computer that controls the car. And of course, these cars already can be attacked, and that's been demonstrated. With autonomy, the problem scales up, of course, because you have less direct input from a human, and of course, because cars, there's hundreds of different makes, etc. But of course, it's still a relatively homogeneous ecosystem, and for any particular type of cars, there's a few percent on the road, right? And if you just can compromise all of those, which is pretty likely because that's the nature of software. If you get one way in, you can repeatedly do it and do it on all the other platforms. Then yes, it just scales the whole problem up, but it's not a new problem. So it just shows that a lot of these really beneficial technologies, of course, have also their dangers, and we need to be aware of them. And, there's clearly a tendency of sort of sweeping these things under the carpet, and once something scales up, then you need a much bigger carpet to sweep things under, and it just stops the scale. So that basically means, the problem is there. It's been there for a long time, and it's just accelerating, and we need to get real about preventing those problems. In terms of what SeL4 can do, well, you need to. I watched 3 years of the introductory video, and the point made by Mark is very clear, right? You need some fundamental technologies to secure the whole thing, and some of these are technologies for securing distributed system communication. That's encryption, that's blockchains, and all this sort of stuff. But in the end, it needs to it bottoms out somewhere where the rubber hits the road or the bits hit the silicon. And this is where you need to base your security on some rock solid foundation. And this is what SeL4 is. There's no reason why SeL4 cannot scale to certainly all the embedded cyber physical space. I think to scale to something like cloud computing requires a fair amount of more effort in making the whole system more scalable. In terms of cyber physical systems, we're pretty much there already, so that this technology is readily deployable, but it doesn't solve the problem in its own. And the other components mentioned specifically by Mark are absolutely essential, but they have to work together.
And, obviously you're not an AI researcher or AI safety researcher or something, but do you have any, hunch on whether those systems could be safe with, every, as the systems that we build are increasingly intelligent?
Yeah, of course, AI systems have safety or security issues on multiple levels. You can attack the AI machinery itself, its algorithms, by mistraining, etc. But that's one thing that's the thing the AI people have to worry about. They need to find solutions to that. I can't help them with this. But in the end, if you assume this can be controlled, then if you can just bypass the system and insert arbitrary data or algorithms, then nothing else matters anymore. And this is where you need the rock solid foundation that is provided by something like SeL4. So again, it's a combination of things, right? You need to the problems exist on different abstraction levels, and you have to have the right mechanisms or solutions at each of these abstraction levels.
But clearly, one would expect it to be at least a necessary condition.
I would think so. Yes. Yep.
Yeah. And so maybe, before I ask you one last question, but why do you think okay, well, actually, let's make it one last question. So what is kind of like the roadmap? What could SeL4 be doing in 5 to 10 and 15 years? And it is kind of, insane or unfathomable that there isn't enough funding to do those things, that you're like actually funding constrained. So, what would help, I guess, what would your plans be? What would help? What are concrete things where, if someone realizes that this is a crucial thing to do, that people could do to help? As concrete as possible in terms of your immediate plans and how people could plug in would be very useful.
Yeah. Thanks for referring to funding. You probably heard that the CSIRO, this national research organization we used to be part of, decided we're no longer required, despite them claiming to do cybersecurity for AI. It makes no sense. Fortunately, other people have realized that there's a real problem, and there is I think there's a lot of gathering of momentum of really putting money where it's needed. It's not only a money issue. Obviously, we can always do more with more money, but it's also a people issue. And that's at the moment, my bigger concern actually is that this kind of technology needs a lot of expertise, which is extremely hard sought after, and there's just not enough of it. And I'm doing my best to produce smart graduates from our advanced operating systems program that understand this technology and the techniques behind it, etc. And are sort of the key ingredients for taking it further. But of course, there's a huge scalability problem here, right? If I graduate 40 of these a year, that's really a drop in the ocean. So besides the money issue, really scaling up the people skills, the expertise is really of critical importance. And I'm observing that now in the automotive space, where I said there's a lot of momentum happening. People are really getting serious about building a truly secure operating system on top of SeL4 for automotive use. And the money is there, or at least I'm reasonably confident that I can get enough parties to commit money to do that. But having enough people to actually do it in a reasonable time frame is a big challenge.
Have you ever thought of doing more like an online course, like a Coursera or something like this?
Yeah, I started I've been putting my slides online for a long time, but I've last year started putting the actual lecture videos online on YouTube. And the problem is it's not just enough to have this material, right? Part of really reducing the skills is a lot of interaction. We give our students a lot of guidance. We and really the whole course has a lot of interaction between tutors and students, etc. And to scale something like that up, I'd be certainly interested. It would require a fair amount of effort, and again, it's sort of a scalability issue. You need to train the trainers in order to really be able to scale this sort of thing up. I really wish we would do it. I'm sort of loath to promise anything, not knowing how thinly spread I am already, but something like that would be really cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's just unfathomable for how potentially impactful this is, or high impact this would be, and for how little people just are working on it now. But I'm guessing,
Yeah.
I'm hoping it would change. Hey, I know we're already 1 minute over time. Is there any way in which people could help plug in, find your work, and maybe leave us with somewhat of a carrot, like, what could you guys achieve in like 5 to 10 years that would make us all a little bit less insecure?
So I think there's still an amazing lack of awareness about SeL4 and the technology it represents. And that is sort of both in funding agencies, in governments and in industry, and sort of getting the word out is really one key factor. And of course, getting people to contribute to the SeL4 Foundation, both in terms of paying membership dues, but also really actively contributing is really core to the way to scale it up. When we set this up, we sort of knew that the need to broaden the ecosystem and reduce depends on a particular organization. A year later, the Big Bang happened, and we were had we not set up the foundation at that time, the whole thing might be dead by now. So there was definitely some good foresight there, and scaling this ecosystem up is just key, and that includes awareness raising. So I'm very grateful for you to give me this opportunity and ability to provide input, and I really hope that you help getting the message out. We really need to get the decision makers, both in the industry and government, really aware of not only the needs, but also the fact that there is already solutions out there that need scaling up.
Yeah, and in fact, have been out there for a long time. Okay, Gernot, I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll certainly try to do our best. And we would love to have you on, whenever you're interested again. So thanks a lot. I think terrifying and really useful at the same time. I think the risks and opportunities at the same time. It's a terrifying and very hopeful talk. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you everyone for bearing with the time difference chasing. And I hope to see many of you again next week. So thanks a lot.